Well, here we are. We're on the back side of this study in the book of Job, kind of on the back stretch, if you want to put it that way. Here in 29, 30, and 31, as we're going to look at tonight. But we've been going through the book of Job, verse by verse, chapter by chapter, and seeing some of the remarkable lessons that are kind of couched in this argument that Job has had with his three friends back and forth. His friends trying to convince Job that he had sin in his life and needed to confess and repent, and then God would give him favor again. And Job sticking to his guns and saying, no, my integrity is intact. I cannot see any area of sin in my life that would have caused these judgments, but I would so love to be able to speak to God, to have, in a sense, that my day in court. And really, if you think about it, you almost could dramatize this entire book as a courtroom scene. Sort of like the old Perry Mason show. I don't know if you ever watched that with Raymond Burr. Remember old Perry Mason? He always won his case somehow. But there were always these dramatic court scenes. And I could just picture Job and on one side and there at the defense and the prosecutors, his three friends, and God is the judge, and Job just longing to be able to present his case. Well, tonight, as we're, in a sense, finishing up Job's words, he's going to do just that. As a matter of fact, I've entitled tonight's study, The Defense Rests, because Job's going to continue. Now, if you recall, we had just a brief little argument from Bildad last time. It was only 6 verses worth. And then Job refuted what he had to say and gave a good discourse on wisdom. And of course, once again in chapter 27, maintaining his integrity. And what is wisdom? And where does it come from? And where can you find it? You can't dig deep enough in the earth for it. You can't have enough money to buy it. But as we saw in chapter 28, verse 23, God understands its ways and he knows its place. So Job giving this discourse on what true wisdom is, as opposed to the wisdom that his three friends were trying to purport. Job, I have a feeling he might have paused at the end of chapter 28 to see, because if you remember, this is round 3, and we heard from Eliphaz and from Bildad, but Zophar, the youngest of the three of them, had not yet spoken, and Job might have waited to see, okay, does this kid have anything to say? Even though this kid was still older than Job was. Does he have anything to say? And he didn't. He stayed silent. And Zophar may well have figured, you know what, if we haven't convinced him yet, then it's not going to happen. Why even waste any more breath trying to get Job to see the truth as far as they were concerned? So after a bit of a pause, Job figures, all right, then I'm going to go ahead and close this case and give my closing arguments, if you will. So after these 3 rounds of speeches, now it's Job's turn to kind of finish things out. And in these 3 chapters we're looking at tonight that Job will use as sort of his defense documents, especially chapter 31, Job is going to kind of do 3 different things in each chapter. In chapter 29, he's going to recall the blessings from the past. So he's going to look at past, present, and future. So I'll outline it for you in case you need to leave early. He's going to recall the blessings of the past in chapter 29. Then he's going to lament the sufferings of the present in chapter 30. And then he's going to challenge God to vindicate him in the future in chapter 31. What lies ahead? What's next? So we're also going to see, especially in chapter 31, Job giving this if I have statements. There's 16 of them. And really what he's saying is, listen, if I've done these things, if I am guilty of this, then God's judgment would be righteous and it would be right. And as a matter of fact, Job even passes sentence on himself in some of the things that should happen if he indeed has done these wrongs. So he'll give those, in other words, to kind of put a punctuation mark and to put himself under oath, challenging God to either condemn him or vindicate him, one or the other. And in this, Job is kind of finishing off saying, God is my judge, I rest my case. But it's interesting how Job starts this here in chapter 29. Because first, like I said, he looks back at his life. He looks back at the past and the blessings that happened there. And it's kind of an interesting balance. Remember that Job started by lamenting his birth. Recall when those 3 friends first came, and after all of this calamity had come on Job's life and come upon him, the first thing out of his mouth is, I curse the day that I was born. I wish that day had never even happened, the day of my birth. And then he goes on there in chapter 3 to say, but even if I had been born, may I have been born, stillborn. In other words, not have seen one day or one moment of life. And then he even continues in that chapter and saying, but since I've been born, then may I just die quickly, because I can't bear the suffering. Because you recall, not only had Job lost absolutely everything, but he was covered from head to foot with this horrendous disease. And we'll even see tonight a little bit more detail about what that disease entailed, just overtaking his body. But now he looks back, and although he lamented his birth, he's going to close by remembering the blessings that he and his family enjoyed. And I think that's a good balance for us to learn right off the top. There are those things in the past, there are those times of trials and of defeat in a sense. But then we can also look back at those times of blessing. And that's a good thing to keep in balance in our lives. C.H. Spurgeon put it this way, too many people write their blessings in the sand, but they engrave their sorrows in marble. That makes sense, doesn't it? We write our blessings in the sand, where just the slightest breeze can blow it away and we don't even see it anymore. But those trials, those places of sorrow, we tend to etch those deep into something solid like marble. Remember what Job himself said back in chapter 2, verse 10, saying to his own wife when she said, why don't you curse God and die? He says, you speak as one of the foolish women speak. And here's his proclamation, shall we indeed accept good from God? And shall we not accept adversity? It's a good reminder for all of us. That's where this started. I know it seems like a long time ago, but when we were first studying this book together, that's what Job, the conclusion that he came to. Look, God brings blessing, but is that the only thing we accept from him? We accept the blessing, and then when the adversity comes along, we somehow resist it, we reject it. That's foolish, because guess what? It's going to come anyway. It's going to befall us. It will take us over, whether we like it or not. So better that we accept it and see God's sovereignty in it. And I think that's probably one of the things that through the course of these arguments, Job has begun a little bit to lose the sight of, and that's God's sovereignty. Someone asked me earlier, well, is Job now to the point where he's sinning? Because it says earlier that in all this, Job did not sin, nor did he speak any wrong against God. And no, he has not yet sinned with his lips, as it says there at the end of chapter 2. But he is starting to lose sight of that sovereignty that he kind of had a better grasp on earlier on. I think he's wearing down. I think finally it's getting to him, and he's trying to put answers to something that really is unexplainable. So he finds himself here looking back. But it's natural for us to, in a sense, long for those good old days, right? When we experienced those trials, and usually the good old days look a lot better, don't they? But you know what good old days usually are? They're bad memory and good imagination, right? Because very often when we look back, we tend to glamorize. We only sort of pick out the parts that we want to remember, the parts that didn't hurt, the parts that were favorable in some way, or grew us up, or matured us in some way, or were just outright fun. But we tend to extract from it those places where maybe we didn't do so well. That especially is dangerous when you look back at your past before you came to Christ. And we can glamorize that past. I've heard sometimes people giving their testimony, and Jack has even mentioned, they spend an awful lot of time back there in the past, and you almost get the sense that they sort of miss it. It's like, wow, things were awfully good back then, even though you were full of sin and heading toward destruction. And and then Jesus saved me, and everything was good from that point on. It's kind of a tagged at the very end there. But it's good for us to have that balance. But the past, as we said before, it must be a rudder to guide us, not an anchor to hold us back. Well, Job is going to start his defense here, his final defense, by remembering that past. And I think it's significant that Job, verse 1, it says, he further continued his discourse and said, and beginning in verses 2 through 6, his number one joy, he's going to list 5 different places of joy that he experienced before all this calamity happened. And his number one joy in his life, as he remembers back, was the presence of God in his home. Let's look at it together, beginning at verse 2. Oh, that I were as somebody read it for me, please. No, I'll do it. I can do it. Oh, that I were as in months past, as in the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone upon my head, and when by his light I walked through darkness. Just as I was in the days of my prime, when the friendly counsel of God was over my tent, when the Almighty was yet with me, when my children were around me, and when my steps were bathed in cream, and the rocks poured out rivers of oil for me. What a description, verse 6. My steps bathed in cream. It's like just walking through something silky and smooth. You get that picture, that image? And not only that, but the rocks just poured out rivers of oil. And again, in Job's time, oil, that was not just a staple. It was a place of riches. It was a place of great plenty when you had oil, especially the olive oil that would be so hard to produce. But here he's saying it's just coming from the rocks. So Job lamented, in a sense, this fact that this joy of having God's presence in his home was no longer there. And yet, as he looks back, kind of like what Joshua said, as for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord. What a blessing when God is not only welcome in our homes, but the center of them. I think it's good for us to examine that for a moment ourselves. Where is God's place in our homes? Is he okay to sit out in the formal living room, where things are kind of kept clean, and really all you do in there is dust a little bit now and then, because nobody actually ever sits on any of that furniture, because it's the formal front room. And that's where God, that's kind of his place. But don't come over back in here into the den, because it's messy back here. We got piles of stuff, and besides that, the TV's probably on a lot. And who knows what we're watching may not be all that edifying for you, God. So just stay right here in the living room, in the formal room. Let alone coming down the hallway into our messy bedrooms that contain that one closet, right? That we hope God will never ask to see. So is he welcome in our homes? And if he is, then the next question is he the center? Is he the center of our homes? Like Job was saying here, verse 3, when his lamp shone upon my head, and when in his light I walked through darkness. And I just as I was in the days of my prime, when the friendly counsel of God was over my tent. When God's word, when his counsel, when it was like just a natural exchange. We walked into the house, and there God's presence was, and we spoke to him freely as a family. And when we went from the door, he went with us, and we never were away from his presence. How wonderful that was. Notice that even there in verse 4, Job kind of longed for that day of his prime. Just as I was in the days of my prime, his youth, he missed that. He missed that time, and now he felt, even though maybe he wasn't old by the standards of his day, we figure he was around 60. He probably lived to be around 120 or so, or maybe close to 200 actually. So he had a lot of life left, but he felt like he just missed those younger days. But it's true, right? I mean, very rarely do people look eagerly with anticipation for old age, right? I mean, it's usually just the opposite. Where it's like, it's not, yippee, I'm getting older now. It's more like you wake up in the morning and you go, and you got to be kidding me. Now that's not going to work? What is it going to be tomorrow? Old age tends to creep up on us, but here it is. It's a proven fact that those who have the most birthdays live the longest. And those who live the longest become the oldest. Took me a long time to figure that out, so I hope you wrote it down. That's very profound. Now, you know what? The fact is, we all get old, and we all eventually die, don't we? That's part of the thing that we fight with old age, is because it's getting us closer to that place. Now, when we have eternity to look forward to, I know I've had conversations lately with some folks, and they're just saying, boy, Jesus couldn't come quick enough, or this all be finished. But everybody dies at some point, except where there may be a few exceptions, like old skiers. They never die, they just go downhill. Or old bakers, they never die, they just fail to rise. They get better. No, there's only one more. Old golfers. Old golfers never die, they just lose their drive. No, Job was longing for his prime. He was longing for those days of still being young and having that vigor. But more than important than that, that time when God was with him in verse 5, your heart just breaks when you read this statement, when my children were around me. Again, Job losing all 10 of his kids in one single day. We can't even imagine. It's the worst thing on earth, because it's not ever supposed to go that way. It is the hardest thing. I've lost a wife. That's very, very difficult. But losing a child is absolutely the most difficult thing, because it's out of the order of things. You know, it's supposed to be grandparents go first, then parents, and then eventually kids. But to have it juxtaposed in any way makes it very, very difficult. And you see Job just kind of, again, remembering the blessings of the past when God indeed was present in his home. Well, the next section is the joy that Job had in having respect from others. Verse 7. When I went out to the gate of the city, which was the place of judgment and leadership, when I took my seat in the open square. Now, in these next verses, 7 through 11, we're going to get a little better idea of the type of person that Job was before his calamity. All it said in chapter 1 is that he was a man greatly respected in the East. He was considered great, and God obviously felt he was a righteous man because he feared God and shunned evil. But here we get a little insight as to just what the day-to-day was like for Job. Again, verse 7, when I went out to the gate by the city, and when I took my seat in the open square, this is what happened. Young men saw me and hid, and the aged arose and stood. So he had great respect and reverence. Even princes refrained from talking and put their hand on their mouth in my presence. Verse 10, and the voice of nobles was hushed, and their tongue stuck to the roof of their mouth. And when the ear heard, then it blessed me. And when the eye saw, then it approved me. Now again, this isn't boastfulness on Job's part. Get that right. He's not trying to brag on himself. What he's trying to say is, this is what life was like. He's giving an account here as he's looking back and remembering the joy of having this respect of others. But like I said, doesn't that give us some interesting detail about what Job's life was like, the kind of man that he was in his city there of Uz, and in this region there in the east. The other thing that Job was just so reminiscent about was the joy of being able to minister to others. Look at verse 12. Because I delivered the poor who cried out, the fatherless, and the one who had no helper. The blessing of the perishing man came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. I was eyes to the blind, and I was feet to the lame. I was a father to the poor, and I searched out the case that I did not know, and I broke the fangs of the wicked and plucked the victim from his teeth. So here Job had great joy, not only in having the respect of others, verses 7 through 11, but in being able to minister to others. It was such a great joy for him. And here we get a little hint as to why God blessed Job so much with great riches. it wasn't just because he was righteous. And pay attention to this, because this is a very important principle. It wasn't only because Job was righteous, but it was because God knew the character of Job's heart, and God knew that the more he would give Job, the more Job would give to others. Job wasn't a bucket. He was a conduit, a funnel. He allowed God to pour into him, and the more that he had, he just lavished that on others. And verses 12 through 17 show us that. All the things that he did. He was there for the poor, for the fatherless, for those that were perishing, for the widows. He put righteousness on those and even guided the blind and those that were lame. He carried them around and took on those that were poor into his own household, verse 16, and searched out even the cases that he wasn't aware of. He even looked for it. It's one thing to have the poor there at your doorstep, which I'm sure as a rich man he had happen often. But Job didn't stop there. He went out into the streets, into places where he really didn't even need to go. And he searched out those that were hurting. He searched out places that he could help others. So we see now part of God's motive in giving Job all of these riches, because Job was just ready to pass them on. And that's important for us too. Because the fact of the matter is, every one of us in this room, it's in some way, have more than others. And any one of us can meet needs of those around us. And it doesn't necessarily have to be material. It could be in serving. It could be giving somebody a ride when they need it. Being there for them. Giving them your phone number and saying, call me anytime, day or night, if you need to talk. Those ways that we can kind of lavish the riches that God has put in our hearts and blessed us with on others around us. So he had great joy in ministering to others. But also, verse 18, he had great joy in having confidence in the future. Verse 18, then I said, I shall die in my nest, in the great place of rest, and multiply my days as the sand. My root is spread out to the waters, and the dew lies all night on my branch. In other words, I'm just constantly refreshed. Verse 20, my glory is fresh within me, and my bow is renewed in my hand. Before all of his calamity, God was blessing Job, and Job was sharing with others, and he had every reason to believe that this is how life was going to go until the day he died. That's how he viewed it. That's how it looked. He expected to go on this way for many, many years. So you can see how this tragedy and this trial, this calamity that came on his life just really yanked the rug out from underneath him and caused him to look inward instead of the joy he had of looking outward constantly. Even verse 20 suggests that in his own vigor he planned to maintain it, to even have more children. That reference to my bow is renewed in my hand, the bow is often a reference to having your quiver full, right? Those arrows in the quiver that were those children of and blessing from God. So he planned to just go on. He had great joy in having confidence in the future. And then he finishes off this section by saying he had great joy in being able to speak words of encouragement to others. Not only was he there to physically help others, but he was also there to speak into their lives. Verse 21, men listened to me and waited and kept silence for my counsel. And after my words they did not speak, and my speech settled on them as dew. Listen to how it refreshed them. They waited for me as for the rain, and they opened their mouths wide as for a spring rain. If I mocked at them, they did not believe me. In other words, if I was sarcastic with them or joked with them, they didn't believe me because they knew my character so well that they knew I was always sincere. I always had the best in mind. I always believed the best in people. Second half of 24, and the light of my countenance did they not cast down. In other words, when I smiled, it lit up their lives as well. Verse 25, I chose the way for them and sat as chief. So I dwelt as a king in the army, as one who comforts the mourners. You see, when Job spoke, it was like a gentle, refreshing rain, verse 23. When he smiled, it lit up a whole situation and gave people hope, verse 24. And as a leader He helped people, the perplexed to make wise decisions, and those who were mourning to be freshly comforted and to gain hope. So he was a good leader, he was a good friend, and he spoke encouragement and life into people's lives. So chapter 29, Job looking back at the past and the blessings that he had. But now he does something interesting in chapter 23, because all of that is now gone. He's no longer with those people. He's sitting outside of town at the garbage dump in an ash heap. And we talked about this a little while back. I was talking to someone about it with the wounds that he had, these boils from the bottom of his feet to the top of his head. There was no place where he could get comfort. Can you imagine walking with boils on the bottom of your feet? I don't think you'd be too crazy about taking a step. But then where do you sit? Where do you lie down? And it's very possible the ash heap was the only soft place that Job could find, literally, to be able to find some comfort. And there he is on the outside of town, and all of that other stuff was gone. So from the delight of the past, Job now suddenly is thrust back into the dismal and disappointing present. However, by refusing to live in that past and by honestly facing reality, Job here is going to take a giant step in maturity and integrity. Now it's interesting, he just gave us 5 areas that were sources of joy for his life here in chapter 29. In chapter 30, he's going to give 5 parallel complaints about what he now no longer has and those joys that he no longer is able to experience. So first of all, as he's looking around at God's judgment now, he's looking at the present. In verses 1 through 15, Job is stating, I have no respect, which relates back to verses 7 through 11, the joy of the respect from others. Those that would literally, kings and princes and young men and old, would cease to speak when he entered the room. But that wasn't the case now. Now he had no respect. Verse 1 of 30. But now they mock at me, men younger than I, whose fathers I disdain to put with the dogs of my flocks. And indeed, what profit is the strength of their hand to me? Their vigor has perished. Now, in this little section, what Job is talking about is he has sunk so low that the men whom he disdained, now he's going to give a description of them in the rest of this section up to verse 8. But these men that he disdained, these aren't just down and outers. These are not homeless. These are not the poor that he ministered to. These are men that were outcast by choice, the criminal element. And not only is it these men, but it's their sons who are now coming to mock him, that are younger than him, these young men, and whose fathers Job wouldn't even give the time of day. And look at the description that he gives here in verse 3 of these men, these outlaws, if you will. They are gaunt from want and famine, fleeing late to the wilderness, desolate and waste, who pluck mallow by the bushes and the broom tree roots for their food. So in other words, just what they can barely get out of the shrubbery out there in the wilderness. Verse 5, and they were driven out from among men. They shouted at them as at a thief. They had to live in the clefts of the valley, in caves of the earth and the rocks. Among the bushes they brayed. In other words, they're like a bunch of donkeys they're out there in the wilderness. And under the nettles they nestled. Now, I don't know if you know what a nettle is. Stinging nettles. Those are no fun. And a lot of times, if you don't know what they look like, you could just be walking out, hiking around, or they even grow wild around us here. You brush alongside one of those things, you're going to know it. It stings, and it'll put little bumps and hives on your arm or wherever you touch it. Well, these guys are literally nestling under them. For why? Because it gives them protection. Nobody's going to come mess with them if they're in a bed of nettles. But the big question is, how do you get there? You've got to go through all of that pain yourself. That's how bad, that's how desperate they were. Verse 8, they were sons of fools, yet sons of vile men, and they were scourged from the land. So here we have Job, who had sunk so low. Now these outcast sons were mocking him. You know, these young men who one time stepped aside every time he walked down the streets, are now, as we'll see in a few verses, spitting in his face. And the worst part is they were the sons of these men who lived as these outcasts by choice, like I said earlier. Now he was sitting among them. Now they're there to the left and the right of him. Poor Job. See, he had no respect. He was blessed with it, but now he has none. So going on in verse 9, now I am their taunting song. Yes, I am a byword. In other words, there are now songs made up about my calamity, and they're singing them in the streets. And I'm their byword. And in a sense, if you think about it, we still do it today, don't we? Oh, brother, I'm having a Job experience. Right? And we all know what that means. We all know what that is. Oh, wow, what's happening in your life? Yeah, it's a Job-like kind of thing. He's still sort of a byword and a taunting song. Verse 10, they abhor me and they keep far from me. They do not hesitate to spit in my face. Like I said earlier, one of the greatest humiliating insults you can receive, even to this day, from anyone. Because he has loosed my bowstring, in other words, God has done this and has afflicted me, they now cast off restraint before me. They're saying, hey, God's not protecting him. God has no longer put a hedge around him, so let's go after Job. Verse 12, at my right hand the rabble arises. They push away my feet, and they raise against me their ways of destruction. They break up my path. They promote my calamity. And they have no helper. They come as board breakers. And under the ruinous storm they roll along. Terrors are turned up upon me. They pursue my honor as the wind, and my prosperity has passed like a cloud. There's no restraint. There's no holding back. He absolutely has no protection. And this gives you a sense, not only was Job diseased, not only had he lost everything, these guys are beating him. They're pushing him away. They're coming after him. They're trying to destroy him. Trying to literally break what's left of his body. They mocked and attacked. They beat him. They ridiculed him. Like a storm that frightened Job, they blew away all of his dignity. Little did Job know that God was honoring Job by having him share in the same kind of suffering that his own son would endure. Because Job was not suffering for his own sin. He was suffering to silence the enemy. Jesus did not suffer for his own sin. Jesus suffered because of ours, not for anything that he had done wrong. And Paul said in Philippians 3:10 that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his suffering, being conformed to his death. Without even knowing it, Job was being honored here through his suffering, through being ridiculed when he had done nothing wrong. Well, in verse 16, Job is now going to say, I have no blessing. Right? Like he said back in verses 2 and 6 of the previous chapter, the blessing of having God's hand upon his home, his presence there. When he looks at his situation now, it certainly isn't there. Verse 16, and now my soul is poured out because of my plight, and the days of my affliction are taken hold of me. My bones are pierced in me at night, and my gnawing pain takes no rest. By great force my garment is disfigured, and it binds about me as the collar of my coat. God has cast me into the mire, and I have become like dust and ashes. So instead of enriching him with blessing, God was robbing him of even the basic enjoyments of life. This is Job's perspective. This is how he's seen it. You see how he's losing sight of God's sovereignty? In the daytime, it says he endured unbearable suffering, his bones being even pierced, a gnawing pain that took no rest. But even at night, there was no rest from it. And his garments were wrapped around him so tightly, it's like they had become a straitjacket around him. This is an indication of someone, in those days, if you think about it, they wore loose clothing, right? Robes. Well, if you're wearing that at night, you're wearing some kind of a robe, that's part of your attire. Well, you have a rough night, you're tossing and turning, that thing's just going to start cocooning around you, isn't it? It's going to wrap tighter and tighter the more you toss and turn. And literally his own robe had become like this straitjacket around him. He could barely move. And there he was, frozen in position at night, bearing his pain. Nowhere else to turn. This continues, having no blessing. Verse 20, I cry out to you, but you do not answer me. I stand up and you regard me, but you have become cruel to me. With the strength of your hand you oppose me. You lift me up to the wind and cause me to ride on it. You spoil my success. For I know that you will bring me to death and to the house appointed for all the living. So where Job before had sensed God's blessing, he sensed his presence within his home. Now he's so far from that. Even verse 20, as he prays, as he cries out, there's no answer. There's no one there to answer. Instead, God's hand of bringing him help, it's only attacking him and tossing him about like a feather in the storm. He's just blowing in the wind. And where Job, if he gets anything wrong, it's that he is attributing all of these things that are happening to him somehow to God's judgment upon his life. Now, what he's being judged for, he doesn't know, and why, he certainly can't figure out. But if he gets anything wrong, it's that. But notice that even in that, he's not accusing God of wrong. He's just stating the facts. Here's what's happened. Here's how it feels. It feels like, like you've lifted me up in the wind and caused me to ride on it, spoiling my success, because all that stuff was stripped from him. He had nowhere to turn. He had nowhere where he could look. So not only did he no longer have a blessing, but verse 24 and 25, he had no help. Right? Back there in 12 and 17, he had the joy of ministering to others. And where are those people now? All of those that he was able to bless with all of his riches, where are they? Verse 24, surely he would not stretch out his hand against a heap of ruins. If I cry out when he destroys it, have I not wept for him who is in trouble? Has not my soul grieved for the poor? It's like Job is saying, okay, if God's hand is against me, then where is the human help? Where are those that could be with me, those that I helped before? Now, Job's motive in doing that in the first place was not to get something back. And that never should be ours either. It's not ever to get something back. But it does make you wonder when you're suffering and when you have pain and you have this tendency anyway to look inward, to say to yourself, but where are those people now? Where are they that I helped? Do they not have something for me, a little something in return? I mean, those people who were benefactors, or Job was their benefactor rather, in their time of need. Was no one there ever? Well, not only that, but Job is saying, verse 26, I have no future. Before he had this joy and confidence in the future that God was going to just have him carry on, that he'd have many years and even many more children. But now when he looks at the present and at reality, he realizes he has no future. He looked for God, but it appeared that God had sent evil and darkness instead of light. Verse 26, but when I looked for good, evil came to me. And when I waited for light, then came darkness. My heart is in turmoil, and I cannot rest. Days of affliction confront me. I go about mourning but not in the sun. In other words, not in place of comfort or warmth. I'm mourning in darkness and cold. I stand up in the assembly and cry out for help. Like I said, he looked for God. He wasn't there. He's sending evil instead and darkness instead of light. What is there to look forward to? What future did Job have? And then he finishes off, again, one last thing, I have no ministry. Where he was able to speak encouragement into people's lives before, now no one will listen to him. As a matter of fact, his words are like jackals, like the howling of a jackal. Verse 29, I am a brother of jackals and a companion of ostriches. So in other words, it's like I'm howling like a jackal or moaning like the ostriches do. Now in verse 30, we get another little glimpse of the extent of Job's illness. Listen to this. My skin grows black and falls from me. My bones burn with fever. My goodness, I can't even imagine. In verse 31, my harp is turned to mourning, and my flute to the voice of those who weep. So, chapter 29, looking back at the blessings before the calamity. Chapter 30, comparing and paralleling each one of those blessings with which he does now no longer have, and he laments the present. But then Job looks ahead for God's judgment here, or justice rather, here in chapter 31. First of all, and it's divided up into a few different parts here, he talks about Job the man, verses 1 through 12, Job the employer, verse 13 through 15, Job the neighbor, 16 through 23, and also 29 through 32, and Job the worshiper, 24 through 28, and then finally Job the steward, 38 through 40. So let's go through this chapter as we finish up. Verse 31, first Job the man. Now Job's going to list 3 specific sins that could trip up any man. He's going to talk about lust in 1 through 4, deceit in 5 through 8, and adultery in 9 through 12. First, lust, 1 through 4. And here's a scripture, verse 1, that has been quoted and memorized quite a bit by men who struggle with lust. I have made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a young woman? For what is the allotment of God from above and the inheritance of the Almighty from on high? Is it not destruction for the wicked and disaster for the workers of iniquity? Does he not see my ways and count all of my steps? Now in this section, in this entire chapter, basically Job's giving his final defense. He's turned from the past. He's looked at the present. Now, looking forward to the future, he wants to now give, in a sense, this final defense document, this legal document that he puts himself under oath, and he asks God to judge him, either to have him fall in judgment or somehow prove him wrong. And here's where those if I have statements come in. But yet it's interesting that Job begins by saying, here's the things that will trip you up. Verses 1 through 12 altogether. But verse 4, it's lust. The first step towards sin. And sin being that first step towards death, as James tells us. But what a great insight we have here in verse 1. And this should be something that we should all take to heart and commit to our lives. I have made a covenant with my eyes. In other words, what I like about this isn't where you see something you might lust after and then think, oh, I better back away from this. No, this is preemptive, isn't it? This is making your mind up ahead of time. I'm not going to go there. I've made a covenant. I've made a promise. I've made this seal, if you will, with my own eyes that I'm not going to look, as the old King James says, lustfully upon a woman. Or, as we see here before us, why then should I look upon a young woman? Because, as he says in verse 2, 3, and 4, God's not going to tolerate that. There's no inheritance from the Almighty for this kind of behavior. And as a matter of fact, verse 4, he sees it all. He counts our steps. Nothing is hidden from him. That's been stated several times. But to lust is to look for the purpose of lusting within our hearts. What does Jesus himself say there in Matthew 5:28? But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. While a sin in the heart is not as destructive as sin actually committed, it is the first step toward that act. You know, sin has those 3 phases, right? The thought, the emotion, the action. When it's first a thought and a temptation, you haven't sinned yet. That's the best place to nip it in the bud and give it to the Lord. But if you hang on to it, you'll get emotionally attached to it. And it's good to stop it there. But it becomes harder and harder. And once you become emotionally attached, then before you know it, the action naturally follows. And then you've committed the sin. So Job is saying, this is the way he did it. He made a covenant with his eyes. So if that's the case, then why? If you've made that covenant, that's a good way to look at it, isn't it? If you've made that covenant with your eyes, then why even glance? As I've heard it said, it's not that first look that'll get you. It's the second long look. that messes you up. And that's where we all tend to fall. And we could spend a lot of time just on this subject. But just again to say, I realize the day and age that we live in, especially the digital age, it is so accessible and so easy for us to view things that are inappropriate, pornography, rampant. But it's in your homes now. It's on your phone. You can carry it with you everywhere. And I would say, if you have a problem with that, do everything you can to guard yourself from it, whatever it needs. Put the blocks up if you can get them, and if not, and it's still a problem, then just get rid of the thing. We really don't need it. I'm living proof of that. I have a dinosaur phone. I don't even text. And somehow I still survive. None of my friends do, because they're all going, I texted you and nothing happened. Well, give me a call. I'll pick it up. Really, I will. And we'll be able to talk, speak to one another. You're kidding me, really? Like actually, like words, like back and forth? Not spell check first? No? Well, let's have a conversation. All that to say, we need to be careful, especially us men, right? We need to be careful. Well, there's lust, and then there's deceit. Verse 5. If I have walked with falsehood, or if my foot has hastened to deceit, then here's where Job is giving one of those if I have. Now, look at the judgment that he puts upon himself. And let me be weighed on honest scales, that God may know my integrity. If my step has turned from the way, or my heart walked after my eyes, or if any spot adheres to my hands, or in other words, anything dirty, anything guilty, then, verse 8, let me sow and another eat, yes, let my harvest be rooted out. So Job is saying, if there's any deceit in me, then let someone else have my crops, or let them just be rooted out. You know, Job had never used deception in his business dealings in order to make money. His scales were honest. He wasn't afraid for God to weigh them in those very scales. You know, Daniel 5:27, right? Belteshazzar was the king at that time, and the writing was on the wall, wasn't it? You have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. That's a scary thing to hear from God. So deceit is something else that can trip up man. And Job is saying, I'm not guilty of that. Something else that can trip men up is adultery, men and women. And Job's saying, I'm not guilty of that. But this is interesting. Verse 9. If my heart has been enticed by a woman, or if I have lurked at my neighbor's door. Now that's interesting. If I've lurked at my neighbor's door, what he's saying there is, if I've hung around to see if my neighbor leaves the house and his wife is there alone. If I'm lurking at my neighbor's door, if I do these things, then, here's the sentence that he passes on himself, let my wife grind for another, and let others bow down over her. For that would be wickedness. Yes, it would be iniquity deserving of judgment. For that would be a fire that consumes to destruction and would root out all my increase. Do you see how seriously Job is taking this? First of all, he talks about lust, which is really the root of adultery. It starts there. But then he's saying, not only do we need to be pure of heart, but he's saying fidelity within a marriage is so important that if it is broken, God has every right to consume us with fire and to uproot us from all of our increase. That's how serious it is. And even here in verse 10, as he pronounces this judgment, let my wife grind for another. In other words, let my own wife become the mistress and the slave of another man. Then I have no right to require her purity or her faithfulness to me. If I go around being enticed by women or lurking about at my neighbor's door. Adultery is a serious thing. And again, coupling with lust, it is something we need to guard against. And this is what I tell the young couples that we sit in premarital counseling. I tell them, don't ever discuss anything about your marriage with anyone of the opposite sex except a close relative. And by that I mean like your parents or your in-laws or that kind of thing. But if you're having issues in your marriage, you grab a brother, guys, or you grab a sister, ladies, if you need that kind of counsel. But don't ever speak to someone of the opposite sex, because that, more often than not, is the place where infidelity begins, where you start discussing the problems of your marriage with some lady at work or some guy there in the workplace or in the office. Guard it. Keep it. Well, then there was Job the employer. Verse 13. If I have despised the cause of my male or female servants when they complained against me, what then shall I do when God rises up? When he punishes, how shall I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make them? Did not the same one fashion us in the womb? So, in other words, Job is saying, I'm not guilty of this, as he's, again, giving his last defense. I have been fair to all of my employees, all those who worked for me, my field hands. I settled their grievances fairly. I was generous with them. And not only that, but I realized that we're all created equal. We're all as one. We came from, in a sense, that same womb. We were created in the same way. He made us all. So why should one be above the other? He was a fair employer. He was also a good neighbor. Verse 16, if I have kept the poor from their desire or caused the eyes of their widow to fail, or eaten my morsel by myself so that the fatherless could not eat of it, but from my mouth I reared him as a father, and from my mother's womb I guided the widow. If I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or any poor man without covering, if his heart has not blessed me, and if he was not warmed with the fleece of my own sheep, if I have raised my hand against the fatherless, when I saw I had help in the gate, then let my arm fall from my shoulder, and let my arm be torn from the socket. For destruction is from God. From God is a terror to me, and because of his magnificence, I cannot endure. So here Job is saying, I've been a good neighbor, all those around me, as a matter of fact. And he even says that if I lift up a hand against any of these, then let my arms just fall off. Let them just be torn from their sockets. That's pretty confident in his wanting to be judged, is it not? That's how confident he was. Now again, Job is not boasting here. He's not trying to make himself look good. He's just laying out his own defense, and he's seeking God for vindication. Well, verse 24, Job is a worshiper. If Job had set anything before the Lord, he'd be guilty. Here's a good blueprint for all of us. Verse 24, if I have made gold my hope, or said to find gold, you are my confidence. If I have rejoiced because my wealth was great, and because my hand had gained much, if I have observed the sun when it shines, or the moon moving in brightness, so that my heart has been secretly enticed, in other words, if I put anything before God, and my mouth has kissed my own hand, I've kissed towards these things, my riches, my gold, the sun, the moon, anything around me, this also would be an iniquity deserving of judgment, for I would have denied God who is above. So he's covering it all. The fact that as a man he kept himself from lust, from deceit, from adultery, that he had been a good employer, that he had been a good neighbor, that he was a true and an honest and sincere worshiper. And here in verse 29, it refers again back to him being a good neighbor, up to 32. If I have rejoiced at the destruction of him who hated me, or lifted up myself when evil was found in him, indeed I have not allowed my mouth to sin by asking for a curse on his soul. So these are talking about his enemies and strangers that came through town. If the men of my tent have not said, verse 31, who is there that has not been satisfied with his meat? But no sojourner had to lodge in the street, for I have opened up my doors to the traveler. So again, being that good neighbor, not just to strangers passing through, but even to his own enemies. Job was saying, my home was open to all. He exercised hospitality. He was neighborly, an art that's sorely lacking in our society today. And then here in this next little section, 33 through 37, we're almost there, hang in. Job had not covered up his sin, but he was willing to literally put his mark, his own signature, on this defense document, and he demanded a hearing. Verse 33, if I have covered my transgressions as Adam, by hiding my iniquity in my bosom. So he knew what Adam had done, and he says, like, if I cover it up. Verse 34, because I feared the great multitude, worried about what people would think, and dreaded the contempt of families, what my family would say to me, so I kept silent and did not go out the door. Oh, that I had one to hear me. So he's saying, if I've covered my sin, if I was more worried about what man would think and what my family would think than God, then a curse be upon me. Would someone please hear me? As he says there in the 35, look at it, he says, here is my mark. In other words, I'm ready to put my signature, my own personal signet on this comment, on this document, this testimony. It's true. Oh, that the Almighty would answer me, and that my prosecutor had written a book. Surely I would carry it on my shoulder and bind it on me like a crown. I would declare to him the number of my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him. So Job is longing for, again, God and his prosecutor to write this stuff down. And if he agrees, if there's no sin found in him, then he would carry it with great honor and even pride on his own shoulders, that he had been declared righteous. And then he thinks one last thing. He also had been a good steward. Verse 38, if my land cries out against me, and if furrows weep together, if I have eaten its fruit without money, or caused its owners to lose their lives, then let thistles grow instead of wheat, and weeds instead of barley. So one last thought, even as he's saying, here, I'm putting my signature on it, and oh, by the way, I was even good to the land. Because if I had not been, it would have literally cried out against me if I had abused it in any way. And my own field hands, if they had been overworked or underpaid, then God would have every reason to give me a bad harvest, a harvest of weeds instead of barley and wheat. So Job was making it clear that he was willing to face the righteous judgment of God. As a matter of fact, look at the judgments he calls upon himself if he's guilty of these sins. That others may eat my harvest and uproot my crops. That my wife would become another man's mistress and slave. That my arms would literally fall off my shoulders. And that harvest would be weeds and thistles instead of any kind of grain. So here it says, very finally, the words of Job are ended. Job had challenged God, because he was sure that God would vindicate him. His three friends were sure that God would condemn him. What we're asking is, what will God do? And the only way to find that out is to come next time. Which will be, by the way, the Sunday after Easter. We won't be meeting for a week. Next Sunday is Easter Sunday. So we'll take that Sunday evening off so you can spend time with your family. But the following week, we'll get in and we'll get a bit of a surprise next week. Kind of comes out of left field. So be ready. Amen. Lord, thank you once again for your word and for this last discourse that Job gives. And even in it, Lord, even though he's struggling and even though he may be misdirected in where these trials are coming from, feeling their judgment from you, how wise of him to take this moment to look back at the past and realize the blessings that you gave, to face the reality of the present and see, Lord, that all of those places where he had blessing before now were places of trial, and yet with that be able to conclude, as I examine my life, as I look to the future for God to bring justice, I can't say that I've sinned, because if I have, then let God's judgment fall. Oh, may we stand, Lord, in that place where tonight, even as we're sitting here in your presence, That hopefully your presence is not only welcome here in this place, but in our homes, in our lives. That we have made that covenant with our own hearts and our own eyes to walk purely before you, to not be deceitful in any way in our doings with others, and certainly to keep not only our homes pure, but our marriages, Lord, faithful and true and a witness to you. That we too can say, if I have sinned, if I have done any of these things, then let God's judgment fall. But if not, then let me walk in purity, O Lord, and let you be my vindication. I don't have to stand up for myself. I don't have to defend myself. You will do that, Lord God. And I know Job will find that out really soon. So help us to learn from this man's life. Help us to take these lessons and appropriate them to our own as we walk in your will. In Jesus' name. Amen. Let's all stand.